So we're just carrying on up here, catching up about Boston, Ken and I. And but I suppose he came here for a reason other than to chat with me, which is to present at Research Conference today. It's really my pleasure to have Ken Getz with us today. Many of you know him, and if you don't know him, I suspect you know his work once I tell you a little bit about who he is and what he does. Ken is a graduate of Brandeis University and a graduate of the business school, the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern University. He is the founder and CEO, the first CEO for a number of years of CenterWatch, which many of you may read regularly, which tracks the commercial research business. So you may, as I said, if you don't know Ken, I suspect you all know his work through CenterWatch. He is now a research fellow at the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, and again, many of you would be familiar with some of the studies that come out of his center. We were recently talking because he is the founder now of a nonprofit in Boston, which is called the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. And one of Ken's real passions is to better engage the public in clinical research. And he's written extensively about this. He's written books for patients and their caregivers that inform them of the research process. And I know of no one better who thinks about the issues related to the individual participant, as well as the investigator that really is doing not the coordinating center activity, but the patient activity in clinical research. So we're delighted he's here with us. He's going to talk to us for the next hour, and I know many of you will have the chance to speak with him later today. Some of you I know already spent time with him this morning. So Ken, welcome to Duke, to DCRI. We're delighted that you're here.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I was just delighted to receive the invitation to come here today. It's been a wild year for me. About 3 months ago, I attended a venture capital meeting in the San Francisco area, and the CEO of Sanofi Aventis was there, and he got up and gave a talk about the drug development enterprise, and he looked visibly upset. He was mourning the passing of this last decade of an enterprise that was just so vibrant. He talked about double-digit revenue growth, a very high profitability in the industry, a period where there were ample resources that could be really thrown at anything to increase capacity and improve speed. And he really lamented the fact that the next decade is going to be so difficult for clinical research professionals and for clinical research to really have the kind of impact that he believed it had had in the past decade. So I want to start with a little bit of an overview of that, the new decade, and what makes it so difficult. In fact, I've heard many colleagues refer to it as the perfect storm. And I just want to highlight some of the areas for you. You can look at almost any part of the drug development enterprise from the commercial side, where you see just tremendous amount of challenge in terms of growth. We have restrictive pricing. We have really soft consumption right now, given the current state of this global economy. You also see an environment that's really characterized by intense competition, not just from generic drugs, but also from companies that are really vying to command a strong market share within a crowded class of therapy. We've seen probably our worst period over the next several years in terms of the volume of sales that will lose their patent protection. In fact, over the next 5 years, close to $130 billion, most of it coming from blockbuster drugs, will lose patent protection. Drugs like Lipitor, which is near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure many of you here, one of the largest and most successful products of all time is coming off patent. So on that side, we see an industry that has really struggled, and we've seen a lot of downsizing. Over 60,000 professionals have been terminated from pharma and biotech companies in the last couple of years, essentially anticipating the challenges that we're going to see on the commercial side. On the R&D side, I would say, for those of you who've been in this enterprise for a while, it's sort of the same old story, right? We're seeing very, very sluggish rate of innovation as measured by the number of new drug approvals. It's essentially slowly cycled downward over the last decade. Success rates continue to be very low. We've seen companies move to consolidate their R&D staff in response as costs have risen. And that's really important for us here because in the past, when pharma and biotech companies downsized, they typically left R&D alone. Right? They would look at detailing. They'd look at manufacturing. But now we're looking at as many as 7,000 research professionals within the R&D functions that are now being terminated. And a lot of that's even driven by a merger and acquisitions of some of the largest organizations. So it's really a very, very difficult environment today. And there are some other areas I'll touch on, like the growing levels of public distrust, the challenges that companies face today in working with regulatory agencies, given such high demand that is placed upon them in order to demonstrate safety and efficacy. Both, we see that a lot with the increased amount of safety assessment activity, for example, in phase 1, and the fact that almost every drug that's approved today comes with it a post-marketing commitment to continue to conduct clinical research. All of this, of course, continues to drive rising costs in drug development. So we've got this perfect storm, and as I mentioned, on the drug development side, it's sort of been the same old story. There's a really fascinating paper that I want to point you to that just was published in Nature Reviews. And what it essentially did is it looked at the drug development enterprise over the last 50 or 60 years, and what they found is that so little has changed. The typical level of output has been less than one new molecular entity approved per year, and that has remained constant per a major company. But what is interesting is that all of the players have changed. Only 12% of the companies that were considered the market dominators back in the 1960s remain. 88% of them have completely changed over. They've either been merged, they've been acquired, they have left the enterprise altogether. So that's been sort of one of the major changes that we've seen, along with the fact that our pipeline composition has changed as well. Only about a third of all of the drugs that are approved today come from major pharma. The vast majority come from mid-sized and even smaller companies. That's up through 2008. So the players have changed. We've seen a real transition in terms of the type of organizations that are innovating. And I would say now an area that is a little bit of an unknown for us. We don't know what 2010 will look like because we don't have a good feel for changes that have occurred in the last year. Q3 2008 through 2009 has been an incredibly tumultuous period. 40 biotech companies have exited this enterprise. A large number of companies have really cut back or curtailed their spending on drug development by as much as 18 to 20%. So I think for those of us who are involved in conducting clinical research, we feel some of that pain. We see how that is translated into project suspensions and project terminations. A lot of CROs have had a very difficult and poor year. But we don't know what that will look like in terms of the organizations that remain and how they will drive innovation. So what I'd like to do is now transition to the study conduct arena specifically. As Dr. Harrington mentioned, I mean, so much of my focus is on the investigative site community and on patient recruitment and retention. I also do a lot of research on R&D management issues that might relate to outsourcing or project planning and study design. So let's begin in looking at the study conduct arena by sort of getting our hands around the size of this market. And we could spend a lot of time just looking at this data. What it shows, and it may be difficult for some of you to read in the back of the room, what it shows is that in 2010, as a whole, the enterprise will spend about $37 billion funding clinical trials. These are trials that involve living human subjects, and they're testing medical interventions. You'll note that only 10% of all clinical trial funding actually comes from the government, comes from the NIH and other federal agencies. And I want to point out there that I believe that number is actually too high because of various approaches to accounting for this information. The NIH would include money spent on training. It would include dollars spent on monitoring and data management, whereas on the industry side, we don't count that within the clinical trials funding arena per se. That would be counted as spending for a CRO or for internal staff to manage that operating activity. So that's one important area for us to keep in mind, that we believe that about 95% of the clinical trials spending today is coming from industry. Very small percentage coming from the government. And that, I think, defies a lot of common thinking about where the funding sources come from. You'll also notice that clinical trial spending and clinical research spending on the government side has actually been decelerating, the rate of growth over the last 4 years. And a lot of that, I think, has been tied essentially to the past administration and its views about apportioning dollars to fund clinical research activity. Industry growth has been substantially faster over the last 5 years and has actually accelerated a bit through 2008. We're now working on updating these figures, and I think you're going to see all around that they will demonstrate, if you will, deceleration in the rate of growth in spending in clinical research as this environment settles down a bit. But again, it's a substantial industry, $37 billion this year. That's pretty sizable, and most of it is coming from industry. And I want to remind you again, just based on the material I showed earlier, the innovation itself, though, seems to be sputtering. We're still looking at the same success rates that we looked at 10 years ago and 20 years ago. The rate of innovation as measured by new drug approvals is essentially constant. It's not changing. So much of the work that is done in this industry to drive innovation is, at best, maintaining a constant level of output. It's not improving and creating higher levels of innovation. So let's now look at the investigative site arena specifically, and I'm primarily focusing on industry-funded research, and again, I think that represents anywhere from 90 to 95% of the market. This is perhaps one of the most, if not the most, inefficient and unpredictable areas in clinical research today. It desperately needs our attention, but it is very difficult to get our heads around all of the problems and how to address them. Here, again, somewhat of a crowded slide, and I'd be happy, obviously, to share any of this material with you. You interview any sponsor company that has been actively involved in clinical research, and they'll tell you that the same pattern emerges time and time again. A small percentage of sites tend to be the major drivers and the major contributors of the bulk of the patients in any given clinical trial. There's sort of this 20-60% rule. The problem is you can never predict which 20% of sites are going to deliver that 60%. McKinsey has done a number of studies now showing that in any given clinical trial, half of all of the sites will either under-enroll or never enroll a single patient. And guess which sites tend to be the largest under-enrollers in industry-funded research? Academic-based sites. I'm going to show you some other data on that in a minute. So part of my message to you also is when you look at the investigative site community, let's not simply assume that we're only talking about the community-based investigative site. These inefficiencies exist in every research center around the world, although on a global basis we're seeing some issues that I'll talk about in a moment that indicate a very nascent environment that doesn't have a lot of the same challenges that the mature regions in our country have. But that's essentially this environment that we're in today. I want to talk a little bit about feasibility, which is one of the most problematic areas. Less than 10% of all sites ever deliver what they said they were going to deliver during the feasibility assessment process. And it's a fascinating dynamic. Sites typically inflate their numbers by a factor of 3. Because they want the business, because they're not even sure when they get a look at an initial protocol that will be, in fact, the protocol that they ultimately administer. And then the sponsor gets that assessment, and they tend to discount it by a factor of 2 or 3. And so they may actually be talking about the same number, but they've never actually stated it in any transparent way. So that's one of the major areas of concern, and a lot of this ultimately leads to a tremendous amount of delay that occurs in clinical research. Over 90% of all trials are delayed by an average of 6 weeks. And depending on who you speak with, we can actually assign a cost to every single day of delay. It costs a company about $50,000 a day in direct out-of-pocket costs to support all the professionals that are conducting the research. And we've seen estimates now as high as 1.2 to 1.5 million in lost prescription sales for every drug that fails to make it into the marketplace. Depends on what figure you want to use. The bottom line is it's very costly. Now, academia is a very, very important area, and I often get into trouble here because I try to meddle and I try to talk about this environment, and it can be very challenging to my own personal reputation because I know that there are many who would really choose not to consider the analysis that we've conducted as necessarily relevant, and also there's a view, certainly in the past, that industry-funded research is not nearly as prestigious. And so that these findings don't necessarily matter. I would argue that in the current environment where access to funding from a variety of sources is critical to every organization, be it one that's based within an academic health system or a community-based investigative site, that need is very strong. In studies that we've conducted, we've found time and time again that academic institutions that are involved in industry-funded research, for example, tend to underperform but require a premium in terms of cost for that underperformance. So in studies that we've conducted, and these have been published in papers that I've, with sort of catchy titles like Second Thoughts About Thought Leaders, and I'd be happy to share those with you. We've found that the academic-based research center tends to charge a 20% premium over the normal overhead rate, in part because of a lot of the traditional overhead that they carry. And I'm talking in particular about a lot of the most prestigious institutions that have very high overhead rates. The rate of enrollment was typically 15% slower, and quality, as measured by the number of errors per case report form, was also substantially higher. So here again, paying a premium for work that typically was below a comparator. In a study that we did where we were hired by the NIH, we actually benchmarked industry-funded trials that most closely resembled a segment of research that is funded by the National Institutes of Health. And this is very difficult to even find comparables. These just happen to be studies that were conducted in similar therapeutic areas. They had the same study design, same treatment duration. And what we found, to our surprise, is that the NIH-funded studies were more expensive, in part because the costs went to a number of other areas outside of the traditional industry grant, like training, for example, and some additional personnel involvement in the study, and that the speed with which NIH-funded research was conducted was slower. Not as much during the treatment phase and during the primary recruitment phase, but in terms of the study initiation, where IRB review and approval was so much slower, and the study closeout phase, where it took much longer, and perhaps the researchers within the academic environment spending more time with the data after they had completed their last patient visit. One other area that I want to just touch on that articulates how inefficient and volatile the site environment is really relates to noncompliance and fraud. Sadly, we only have good data from the FDA. No other regulatory agency around the world makes available all of the data on the complaints that they've received in a given year and the results of inspections of sites that have received these complaints. But what we found was really astounding. We track this every single year. Up through about 1999, the FDA received about 10 complaints a year for noncompliance and fraud, and these typically were centered around the investigator, the individual who has signed the 1572. And then suddenly we saw a tenfold increase in the rate of complaints filed, and it's continued to rise steadily ever since. Any thoughts on what might have driven that rate of growth? Well, I'll give you a hint. The FDA did offer a toll-free 800 number, And they also launched a website where you could file your complaints anonymously, and that helped a lot. But if you remember, 1998, 99, 2000 were periods where we had very, very visible, tragic patient deaths. Many of them resulted in suspensions of some of the most prestigious institutional IRBs. So there was tremendous amount of focus and sensitivity around this, and that has been a major driver of just raising awareness and the importance of filing a complaint. The vast majority of complaints result in no action against a site or a voluntary action. About 3% result in an official action, which may ultimately require a termination of the trial or suspension. But this is yet another area where we see very, very inefficient and very, very volatile performance at the site level. I'm a pepper and salt junkie. It's the first section I turn to in the Wall Street Journal every day because I get more good information there than anywhere else. And so I'm going to frame my discussion going forward with a look at some of the solutions that companies have implemented, and then I'm going to talk about solutions that I feel need to be implemented. For those of you who can't read the caption, it says, "It'll take a little getting used to, but we're saving a bundle on cubicles, and you'll find you're scratching a lot less." The point is that most solutions that have been implemented by industry, I can't really speak for the NIH directly, but many of you, I think, are much closer to that, have really focused on essentially controlling costs and even improving costs, and ultimately managing or controlling practices and behavior. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but what I'm going to argue is why focus on controlling a process that's already broken or that really needs to be repaired, and why not instead look to nurture and improve that operating environment so that you're managing for success as opposed to mitigating failure. And that's a big part of our message. So let's look at some of those solutions. One that I know is top of mind here and in many parts of the country is just the rapid rate of globalization of clinical research. More than half of all clinical trials that are FDA regulated today are conducted outside the U.S., and the fastest growing regions, of course, are areas that you're quite familiar with, Central and Eastern Europe, India, and China. We could spend a lot of time talking about the challenges that this presents from an ethical standpoint in terms of operating logistics and complexity. But clearly, one of the primary drivers has been the pursuit of cost advantage, right? The ability to find a pool of well-trained investigators and study staff that cost far less. In fact, in India and China, they're literally half the price of the typical Western European or US-based investigator. And the speed, at least the speed for enrollment, as measured by the number of patients that are recruited per month, is substantially higher. Now, those advantages are slowly going away. Some sponsors that I've interacted with have pointed out that investigators in India, for example, are actually recognizing that they're undercharging. And you're starting to see some price parity emerge there. But to some extent, this was viewed initially, certainly in the past decade, as a wonderful opportunity to lower overall clinical trial spending by pursuing lower cost resources in other parts of the world. Hedging is another strategy that many of you may not know about per se, but it's become quite widespread. And what this is all about is not only moving overseas and ultimately funding a more fragmented base of globally dispersed investigators, but also spreading the risk across a larger number of sites. What sponsors tend to do now is they enroll larger numbers of investigators, each being asked to recruit a smaller number of patients. So it's actually changing the economics of study conduct. It is commoditizing clinical research because the idea now is to hedge risk by no longer relying on a single research center or a group of research centers, but instead looking to throw the dollars out there and see how many investigators can ultimately deliver a patient or two. So here it essentially, as I said, creates a commodity-like mindset where it even favors the novice investigator someone who may not have a lot of experience in this enterprise, but can get into it at an attractive price point for sponsors who are looking to control their clinical grant spending. Outsourcing has been a huge solution pursued, and there are lots of ways that we can look at articulating the high level of reliance that pharma and biotech companies place on CROs today. If you notice here, we're just looking at total spending on contract clinical research services compared to total spending on a global basis on drug development overall. And this is not just FDA regulated now, but I'm talking about all regulatory agencies. And what you see is that the rate of growth in spending has really sharply outpaced, for outsourcing, has sharply outpaced the rate of growth in spending for drug development overall. Well, what's driven this? Well, a lot of it has been the pursuit for capacity. As industry has operated more leanly, it's looked to focus on variable resources as opposed to high fixed cost resources to conduct a growing volume of clinical research activity. The fact that we had so many small companies, biotech and mid-sized pharma, many of them had never conducted clinical research at all or in a specific therapeutic area, and CROs really offered expertise for them. I will say that most companies will tell you that they believe CROs historically were more expensive. So cost may not have been the driver here, but it was the access to capacity. I would also point out, though, that no one knows really what the cost of a CRO is relative to the sponsor's cost anyway. No one has found a good way of ever measuring the fully loaded cost within pharma so that they can compare that to the total cost to retain a CRO or CROs. But the point is that these were the CRO really offered a tremendous opportunity to help companies manage growing volume without having to delay this research activity. They could transfer their capacity needs over to the CRO. And there are other reasons as well. In a study that we conducted several years ago, we found that actually high CRO usage was correlated with faster development speed. And that was a real eye-opener for people. Think about it. When you can beat up a contractor, you can set even more aggressive timelines and really micromanage that, and it'll come through faster. In fact, in our measurements of speed, and we looked at a whole host of pivotal trial milestones, we looked at the amount of time it took to ultimately reach a submission, and in every case, companies showed us their planned timeline and then the actual timeline. We also assume that companies would know that with a CRO they're going to have a more aggressive timeline, and so their plan to actual reflected their knowledge that the CRO would deliver that speed. And sure enough, the CRO still met the timeline more frequently and tended to shave several weeks of time on almost any measure that we looked at comparable quality. But again, what we couldn't really understand is what the cost basis might be. So the point is that CROs historically were a powerful solution and have been a powerful solution. And I think going forward, you're going to see a continued evolution on the part of sponsors in trying to structure their relationships to extract even higher levels of efficiency. And that's really what I want to talk about briefly now. You've probably heard the terms functional service provider, multifunctional service provider, integrated alliances. These are all ways of articulating new relationships that sponsors have established with their CRO partners. The typical relationship was very transactional in nature. A company didn't have enough study monitors, it scrambled, sent out RFPs on a Friday afternoon, told the CRO it had till Monday morning to get a proposal back for 5 additional monitors or for 10 additional monitors, for 5 medical writers, whatever. So very, very transactional in nature. As you move to the right-hand side here, and as we look at more of the functional relationships, here you see the sponsor looking to transfer more of the responsibility and the risk over to the CRO. So instead of outsourcing the task, now the function is being outsourced. And we have a number of companies that do all of Pfizer's monitoring for a given project, or ultimately even for the portfolio. They may provide all of the data management for Novartis, for example. And in that case, what you see is a real shift in the amount of oversight that the sponsor is providing. The level of micromanagement is starting to go away, and these are ways that companies are extracting a higher level of efficiency and lowering their costs. And that's really articulated here in this schematic, where on the far left-hand side you see the traditional approach, very reactive, very ad hoc. It's really characterized by having large numbers of contract providers. In fact, companies in the transactional model have on average 40 to 50 CROs that they're managing at any one time. Some of them full service, some of them niche service providers, some of them solo, individual or very small organizations. But having to manage all of that is an inefficient process in and of itself and very complex, especially on a global basis. On the far right-hand side, you see this migration toward having integrated systems and integrated standard operating procedures, where the CRO is no longer required to follow the sponsor's SOPs, but instead the CRO follows their own, governed by a set of coordination guidelines. And that's really very powerful. Many companies have hired CROs in the past to conduct clinical research activity for which the CRO has done hundreds of projects in that area. The sponsor has done few, if any, and yet they require the CRO to follow their SOPs. That makes very little sense. So this integrated approach, this alliance approach, which is now tied to the portfolio and not the project, is viewed as a very promising approach to engaging CROs, really as part of the partnership or the team, with far less oversight and also with far less redundancy in terms of shadowing of personnel to ensure that the CRO has really followed the project and supported the project adequately. We're going to see a lot of problems as we move in this direction, however, and we're already seeing some of this play out when we run into a problem that might result in a poor outcome in a clinical trial. It might result in a patient death or some other tragic outcome where the sponsor will look to the CRO as really being the party responsible, and the CRO will turn to the federal guidelines and say, well, ultimately, wasn't it still the sponsor who should be accountable? So actually the relationship between the sponsor and the CRO is going to change over time, and this really requires a new look by regulatory agencies to accommodate the shift in outsourcing. Another key solution that sponsors have pursued, along with globalization and hedging and outsourcing, have been a whole host of these remedial approaches. Everything from the use of proprietary and commercial databases to select sites for which the investigator is a known high prescriber of a given drug or in a given therapeutic area, that there's a high concentration of patients in a particular area. We see a number of creative, many of them IT or e-clinical trial solutions that are really designed to help the sponsor look at the site's performance in real time and manage this activity with immediate feedback. A lot of the EDC and the data management approaches, clinical trial management systems, these are all wonderful tools that sponsors can use to monitor the progress that their sites are making. But as I said earlier, when you're monitoring performance that really it needs to be improved greatly, where it's really subpar, there's really something wrong with that. And as a result, I see a lot of the remedial approaches as really only having a marginal impact on performance long term. So let's just do a little bit of a checkpoint here. A couple of key takeaways I want to highlight on this environment. First, actually one more area, and then I'll give a highlight. I want to talk about assurance and transparency, because that's another important way, a solution that's been implemented. And what this is all about, in my mind, are efforts to assure the public that research professionals are well-credentialed, they're well-trained, and to provide greater disclosure and transparency. And these are terrific ways that we can try to demonstrate to the public that we have an enterprise that has adequate oversight and controls, and where we require an adequate level of credential and credibility. The problem with many of these approaches, however, is that they don't have much teeth in them. There isn't a large incentive other than self-motivation for a lot of professionals even to pursue a certificate or a degree program, and there is no evidence to suggest that sponsors select an investigator that's been certified over one that has not, or a study coordinator has been certified and one that has not. So the checkpoint now, we see this tremendous movement toward transferring more operating risk over to CRO partners, and the CRO has essentially become an integral part of the development enterprise and the driver of innovation. We see on the investigative site side, it continues to be as inefficient and as complex as possible, but a lot of the historic solutions have really favored the novice investigator or attracting less experienced investigators as opposed to those that have more experience and more infrastructure, hence more cost. And as I mentioned also, we see a lot of focus on assessing the performance of this landscape, but not on improving their operating performance, raising it to a higher level. So let's look at a few key areas that I think must become part of our focus going forward. And this first really gets at perhaps one of the largest root causes of problems. The caption, what's the point of having a high-speed internet connection, instant messaging, and a BlackBerry if I waste 45 minutes a day looking for parking? The point is here that there are rudimentary areas that must be addressed if we really want to see profound and measurable impact of really elevating the level of performance at the investigative site level and ultimately at the level of innovation. And that really is the protocol, our blueprint. We have known for some time that this process is broken, but for a variety of reasons, companies have been reluctant to address it for fear that it would be just too traumatic for the organization to address. These are activities that are largely based on legacy processes and approaches. And there's also the fear, of course, that if you start to meddle here and ultimately you fail to collect a certain amount of data, that could ultimately wreak havoc in the organization and ultimately result in a loss of jobs for people. So job security is another issue. I mentioned to you that noncompliance and fraud, the number of complaints filed has been rising steadily. The number one area of complaints is protocol noncompliance and protocol violations. So one of the early signs that I've been tracking for some time. When I ask companies for data on how long it takes to ultimately finalize or approve a protocol, we see such wide variability, anywhere from 4 months to as much as 9 months to finalize the protocol. And even after it's finalized, we see growing numbers of amendments, particularly in phase 3 clinical research, where we've heard reports from some companies that upwards of 7 amendments on average have to be implemented per protocol. Each amendment today, it's estimated, the implementation of each amendment runs roughly $500,000. So you can immediately see the tremendous cost just to support this current process. Genentech, Pfizer, and others have also recently reported that a large percentage of their data is never used after they've collected it. And that has a whole host of not only operating and economic ramifications, but ethical ramifications as well. So at the Tufts Center, we have conducted several studies. One in particular that I want to focus on here, all around protocol design and why it's such a problematic process and its impact on operational effectiveness and performance. And what we found was really astounding. No surprises for you, but it's nice to get some metrics around this. We found, for example, that over time, the rate of annual growth in the number of unique procedures per protocol was rising by about 7% a year. That's the number of unique procedures, regardless of the number of times they're conducted. If you then add in the frequency within which each procedure is conducted, that rose at an even faster rate, almost 9%. So we're conducting procedures more frequently than we did in the past, and the typical protocol today involves 160 procedures. Eligibility requirements. We saw the rate of growth approximately 12% a year, where the typical protocol across all therapeutic areas and phases involves about 40 inclusion and exclusion criteria. It's a wonder that we find patients to qualify for any of our trials. And then we also adapted an approach that had been developed by Medicare, where they, to calculate reimbursement costs, they looked at procedures and the resources that conducted those procedures and the amount of time it took to perform them, and came up with a value measure. And we applied the same approach to procedures in clinical research, and they mapped fairly closely. We found that the rate of growth in the burden to execute the protocol was rising at more than 10% a year. So not only are sites being asked to conduct protocols that involve larger numbers of procedures that are being conducted more frequently, but the effort on the part of the site to conduct those procedures was rising at an even faster rate. When sites tell us that they feel that they're being asked to do more for fewer dollars, that also is supported in our study, where we found, once you adjust for inflation, that the cost for every procedure was declining at almost 8% a year. So this really helps us very quickly get a feel for some of the disconnects that are occurring when we look at protocol design. When we now apply that to performance, and here we looked at simpler protocols that were conducted in an earlier time frame to more complex protocols conducted in a later time frame, and we found just some astounding measures of impact. For one, the number of case report form pages rose from an average of 55 to 180. And we saw that cycle times grew dramatically, less so at the beginning of the trial. Historically, there's been so much pressure on sponsors to get a patient in a study that most can really get that first patient quickly. But by the end of the study, cycle times were 70% longer on average. And a lot of that had to do with the difficulties of retention. Asking patients to endure 160 procedures during the treatment phase of the program is really quite astounding. And it's amazing that patients even stay in our studies. Patient recruitment and retention measures across the board got worse, from inquiry through randomization to ultimately completion. So what's being done in this area? Well, this is perhaps one of the most frustrating parts, as I mentioned. It's hard to tackle this, and every company has its own approach to designing its protocols. It has its own culture within which protocols are developed. There's a tremendous amount of pressure that the scientific community within sponsor companies places on operating staff, and for a long time, operating staff have really felt unable to push back. But I'm seeing companies focus on a number of key areas, and there are examples of pilot tests and efforts to improve protocol design. Many companies are trying to sort of isolate where complexity is rising the fastest, and it tends to be in oncology studies, infectious diseases, and in endocrine studies as well. The protocol authoring process, that's one area where companies are really trying to sort of challenge the typical approach where they use a template that was developed and maybe out of context really, or out of date with a lot of new approaches today to study design. Redesigning the entire process, finding ways of streamlining it is a very, very risky undertaking, but companies believe that if they can redesign the process going forward, it will have a more profound impact long term. And protocol feasibility is another key area where companies are looking to create even more concrete places where external advisors, including patient advocacy groups, health professionals, and study volunteers could provide some feedback, but still adhere to a very tight timeline. So those are some of the areas. And at the Tufts Center, we're doing a number of studies now continuing to look at this area. One in particular is in the area of protocol amendments and understanding why they occur and how they can be prevented moving forward. And the next caption, would it kill you to devote one little wall to gathering? These are a cave couple. And the point here is that sponsors, I believe, have really failed to appreciate and acknowledge and support the true gift that the site gives the partnership. And as I said, the efforts in the past have largely been to control costs or contain costs and to control behavior or practice. I think sites are, especially in the current operating environment, are really just struggling to continue to support these high demands and looking for assistance. I showed you a diagram that sort of captured the emergence from transactional and the evolution from transactional to more of this integrated alliance approach, the same type of model can be applied when we look at the sponsor-site relationship. This is not occurring today, although I do hear companies talking about it. And the idea is to move away from the typical reactive, send out an RFP, engage the site in a very short-term trial basis and reinvent the wheel every time, where a site that was even a top performer on one study can't even convince the same party at the sponsor company to consider them for the next trial, to more of a nurtured alliance, where the sponsor is literally providing in a centralized way tools that the site can use, assistance that the site can use in managing its operation effectively, in complying with regulatory guidelines, in recruiting and retaining study volunteers under more of a portfolio approach, where the site has some guarantee of ongoing work with the sponsor and can then dedicate the resources long-term to support it. I know that Quintiles for a while had an individual who was really focusing on this, and this has been an important area. Pfizer's been talking a lot about this. Eli Lilly and company has tried to establish this kind of alliance relationship. The jury is still out as to how effective it will be long-term. But for a number of sites, there's a ray of hope here that they might be able to enter into an improved relationship with the sponsor that will be also more integrated and more supportive. GCP compliance is perhaps one of the most onerous areas for investigative sites today. We could spend a lot of time talking about this. This was an interesting study that was published in the Quality Assurance Journal in 2008 by a Swedish group of researchers. And what they found when they actually itemized the costs to support a clinical trial budget, they found essentially that 50% of the entire cost was going to support some level of quality assurance or quality control. And they concluded that compliance oversight tends to focus on doing things right, not on doing the right things. Most sites are at wit's end today. They feel that so much of the compliance burden is additive. It essentially just compounds an already onerous set of activities. And you can look in a variety of areas to just see how challenging that might be. Sites that conduct 30 to 40 clinical trials a year and they have to sit through GCP review at every investigator meeting. That's just a very superficial example. Adverse event reporting, for example, is a very, very obscure and very difficult process for the sites to manage, and one that I know City has been focusing on as an important area where a lot of clarity is needed. The whole area of reconsent, particularly when protocol amendments are implemented, is one that also has a lot of uncertainty. What's needed here is really speaking with the sites on the part of the sponsor, and then ultimately sitting down with regulatory agencies and finding all those areas where there are incompatible guidelines, conflicting guidelines, some that are outdated, that need to be updated and streamlined to create a compliance burden that is manageable. The last area I want to touch on is in the area of education and outreach. I just have a few minutes left. But what I want to talk about first is the fall from graces of our industry. When I first entered this enterprise in the early 90s, Al Gore was heading up a committee looking at all of these industries and trying to find those that were considered national treasures, that showed that they were the most financially healthy and they were doing the most for society. And the pharmaceutical industry came out number one. This was the Committee on Competition. And I'd love to share that report with you because, if anything, it affirmed for all of us that this was such a good industry for us to be in. It provided so much social good and made us feel good about the work that we do. Well, today, in public opinion polls, the pharmaceutical industry and clinical research tends to be lumped together with used car sales and the oil industry. The lack of trust in the professionals that support the enterprise is remarkably low. The public generally believes very strongly and understands the need to conduct clinical research before a therapy or an intervention can be launched in the marketplace. They understand that. But what they really have a hard time with is all of the reports, many of them unbalanced in the media, that really reflect the failures on the part of FDA to provide adequate oversight, or IRBs and their failure to provide adequate oversight, the professionals within pharma and at the research centers where there's a view that they're largely motivated by corruption and greed. Popular culture is equally unbalanced. If you think about most films and most novels that touch on clinical research, the professional is always depicted as this sinister and dark individual who is looking to sort of game the system for personal benefit, right? To falsify data, to exploit a vulnerable patient population. So the public has just been bombarded by all of these messages, and some of them have been warranted. There have been plenty of examples for which we can look at professional. There are extreme cases and few and far between, but for which there really was basis for outrage. The point is, however, that as a whole, as an enterprise, we've never responded to this depiction. And we've left the responsibility of managing our image to the investigative site, which really seems to be misplaced. Public impressions, public awareness, public education really is a collective problem that has to be supported by all stakeholders in the research enterprise. And that's really what the last area I just want to touch on with this very simplified view. The focus in the industry is typically to fill clinical trials. It's really on recruitment and retention for a specific trial. But it's actually these three areas that are essential to ensure that recruitment and retention is ultimately successful. It's all part of that message. How do you support the enterprise so it has a chance, it's set up for success and not failure? On the enhancement side, what we're talking about is raising public and patient awareness of clinical research. Today, the vast majority of the public will tell you that they wouldn't even know where to go to find information about a clinical trial. So most people are scrambling once they or a loved one has been diagnosed with a serious illness. They have very little time to get up that learning curve. And so literacy tends to be very low until they're now in a position of real urgency and desperation. On the enable side, we have to find ways of engaging health professionals who really play a minimal part in clinical research today. For those who've had some exposure to the enterprise, I'm talking about physicians and nurses, healthcare providers, they tend to have a more favorable view. But the vast majority of physicians are really detached and disengaged. And if they do refer patients into clinical research, the number that they refer is remarkably low. Less than 0.5% of all of the patients that they may see during the course of a given year. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to engage a support network and also to arm our volunteers with the tools that they need to really evaluate clinical research and determine whether a trial is right for them. And on the sustaining side, what we're really talking about is how to keep those people as part of the enterprise once they've been through the profound experience of participating in a clinical trial. 80% of all volunteers tell us that the minute the trial ends, the minute they've completed their last visit, they never hear from anyone. They never hear from the site. They never hear from the sponsor of the study. And obviously there are some restrictions in terms of the sponsor's direct communication with the patient. But this is yet another place where, as an enterprise, we've really failed to engage and sustain the relationship with volunteers who now have had exposure to a very professional and compassionate group of research professionals. So that's really was the backdrop, if you will, for my organization, SysGrip, which is now 5 years old. And you can learn a lot if you're not familiar with it already by just going to our website. And I just want to talk about or touch on a few key areas that I think are really creating some excitement. We have our two primary areas of focus are national outreach and local outreach. On the national side, we have public service announcements. We're developing a Hollywood script that has clinical research participation as a secondary storyline as opposed to the primary plot, where the protagonist is dealing with another issue and they happen to be involved in clinical research on the side, because we've learned that most Americans in particular learn by watching TV and movies. So this kind of idea about edutainment is a very exciting way to raise awareness and to depict clinical research as part of everyday life, not part of this, as I said, this clandestine and sinister behavior. And there's a lot of other areas that we're focusing on the national level. CISCRP has recently launched a post-trial results communication initiative funded by Pfizer, and we're rolling this out to all clinical trials where CISCRP will contact the sites and send materials to them so they can keep their volunteers informed and aware of when the results will come out once their participation has ended. And on the local side, you're all, I would imagine, familiar with our Aware for All program, which is really one of our proudest and flagship activities. We're also doing a lot now in terms of interacting with science museums around the country. We have a grant to develop a kiosk that will rotate from science museum to science museum, and we're also trying to create a program that can help raise awareness at high schools around the country, and we're looking for examples that we could use and then implement nationwide. Ultimately, we're going to move globally. In fact, I learned about a year ago that there was an organization called CISCRP in Belgium. We had never heard of it before, and so at first I was flattered. Imitation is a form of flattery until it's a felony. And at that point, we had to really force them to change the name, but at least it gave us yet another confirmation that what we're doing here in the States really needs to be done around the world. So we're very, very proud of the work that we're doing at CISCRP, and for those of you who are interested, we're always looking for volunteers. If you ever see an article in the media that you feel is unbalanced, send it to us. We have this packet that we send. We airlift it to journalists, and it's entitled 101 Things That You Should Have Mentioned About Clinical Research. I think we've sent about 30 packages to Bloomberg News. They must absolutely hate us. But, you know, if you ever see something, and obviously as an independent nonprofit, it's much easier for us to do this kind of work. Let us do the legwork for you, and we're happy to interact with the media and with journalists. We're always looking for people who would like to join our Speakers Bureau. We get calls from public libraries and community centers looking for someone to come and give a talk for an hour. Some of the high schools, as I mentioned, would love to just have a professional come out and talk about clinical research as a possible career option and even as just something to be aware of. So we'd be happy to organize speaking opportunities for you if you're interested. So with that, I do want to close with a bit of an upbeat note. I know I've sort of painted somewhat of a bleak picture. The bulk of my presentation really talked about this perfect storm of negative trends. But I do want to say that we're a remarkably resilient enterprise as well. And I think at the end of the day, the perfect storm will ultimately deliver a landscape that I think will be far healthier. It's going to be painful getting there, but it's going to be far healthier than we are now. I think that the movement toward these integrated relationships with CROs is very, very positive if it can be managed carefully. I also think that if we can move the sponsor-site relationship to one where there's far more support for the success of the site, that's going to be critical, and some of that might even come in the form of fewer sites globally. We might actually see companies look to minimize the amount of global complexity that they have to manage today, logistically. There's a lot of talk now about learning health systems where essentially clinical research is integrated into the point of care, and I think that may become an integral part and will become a very important part of the site landscape going forward, and that is a critical area that has to be supported by the sponsor and the CRO if they're truly there to exploit the value of these integrated learning systems. I do think that we've waited long enough not to do something about the protocol design challenge, and I think going forward that is going to be a very hot area for change going forward, and certainly adaptive clinical trial designs and some of these streamlined process improvements I think are going to become much more prevalent going forward. So with that, I know we started a little bit late and I talked a little bit over, but if I could open it up for some questions, is that all right? Great. Thank you very much.
So we did start a few minutes late, so let's give people in the audience a chance to ask some questions. Judy?
now we just need an hour to ask you questions and have some discussion. I have two questions. One is, I was really interested in your comment about the indices practice of hedging. And I was thinking, as we're getting larger and larger trials and trials are going global, we're needing larger numbers to find smaller differences. That really has implications and a threat to the possibility of getting a tremendous amount of variability in the reliability of the information we're getting from those trials. And I just wondered if you could comment on that. And the second question is, I'd like to know what you commented that by our not responding to the negative things in the press about industry, not kind of giving the alternate view, the sites kind of get the brunt of that when they're trying to recruit patients to trials. And I think many of us just recently, with all the press recently on one particular drug and a local drug company, are very concerned about what we can do. What's the constructive thing to do to give a more balanced view? The public is getting such a distorted view, and when when congressional committees are issuing whether drugs are safe or not safe and what should happen, it's really a dilemma that I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, the response to your first question, I think that's absolutely an issue, and I think to some extent industry has really just not caught up with it. I think the race to globalize and to conduct studies among larger numbers of sites, smaller numbers of patients, is one that really has been managed primarily from an operating advantage standpoint. And really, I think as companies recognize that success rates and even failure rates are going to be that much higher, they're going to look deeper to understand what may be driving that. And a lot of that will have to do with a lot of the statistical power of spreading your patients across a much larger number of locations. So I think that's something that's going to sort of hit the wall eventually. Hedging, interestingly, has not even been acknowledged as an issue, although I've heard publicly a number of companies sort of mention that in looking at recent site placement activity, that's exactly what they're doing. They seem to be attracting or contracting smaller numbers of patients per site, but it hasn't really struck them that this is a pervasive activity and it's going to be a major problem for them. So I think you're dead on, and hopefully we're going to see more focus on that going forward. Your second question, I didn't understand, Judy, what you were getting at specifically. And I was just wondering if you could phrase it as a question related to really sort of...
when we read press articles that are very, that are not balanced and that are denigrating the pharmaceutical industry to the point where it leaves the public fearful about whether they should ever go into a clinical trial, what constructive action can individuals in the industry, knowing better what the situation is, do? What should we do so that it's not all on the site to have to recruit patients with the public thinking industry is just the worst thing in the world, they should never volunteer?
Gotcha. Okay. I think a couple of things. One, the public is remarkably leery and cynical when it comes to their view of the media as well. So they discount information that they receive even from journalists. And I think when someone is dealing with a health issue, they still tend to really self-advocate and want to find out as much as they can, and they get around some of that. I think there's a lot of constructive work that can be done. A lot of it relates to responding more in a more timely fashion. I mean, industry has tended not to react for fear that it would lend credibility. And that's always been, I think, the wrong way to handle some of these crises, although that's the way public relations managers tend to treat it. And I think also relying on a group that's dedicated to this kind of education, that's neutral, like a CISGRIP, is another helpful way to do it without pointing to a professional that might appear to be self-serving.
Go ahead, Ron. And I agree with you. That was spectacular. And I hope we'll actually be able to get all of our clinical research coordinators on campus. I don't know how many hundred there are now, but there are a lot. I think anybody involved in clinical research could benefit from hearing this. But I want to get back to us. You gave us, more bad news about academic medical centers. What do you think should be done at this point about what you described as poor performance and higher costs? That's usually not a winning formula.
It's a great question, Rob, and I find often when I give this talk to academic groups, I find people are quick to laugh at the situation, in part because it's very awkward, and I think there's an acknowledgement that it's very hard to affect change to address these issues, this inefficiency. I think out of necessity, a lot of it has to be addressed, and we saw this back in the early 90s. At that time, I think NIH funding was more limited. Its growth was more limited, and some institutions really started to look a lot more closely at forging relationships with industry. And they really took it upon themselves to take lessons from the migration to the for-profit community, where you had leaner operations, you had efforts to really deliver a higher level of customer service to the sponsor, really catering to them. And some groups were very successful at this. University of Rochester was one. I would say DCRI was very, very good at acknowledging that industry-funded research is very important for us to understand what their needs are and how we can somehow deliver on that. So I think out of necessity, not just for industry-funded research, but for government-funded research as well, a higher level of efficiency is going to be required, and in order to compete, we're going to have to look for those institutions that are willing to take those risks.
Would you at least concede that there should be some margin? Because after all, somebody has to train. I mean, all physicians and nurses are trained at academic medical centers. That's part of their job, and it induces an inefficiency, which I completely agree with you. We're way more inefficient than that calls for. And also, serving sponsors is important to do, but there also is built into the system a critical role for the investigator to stand up to the sponsor when they're doing the wrong thing. I mean, the way consent works is with the investigator, not with the sponsor, and that's for a reason. Because the sponsor stands to make money based on the results of the study. So how do you find the right balance in that?
Rob, can I just extend it maybe before you answer? Because the question I've been wanting to ask you is, I actually think this will be somewhat of a self-serving comment, that these integrated relationships with CROs and pharma are not necessarily in society's best interest. It gets to Rob's point, because we then create a system where everybody involved, the academics are going away, has a vested financial interest in the success of what I'll call drug development, not research. So where's the balance? I don't think, for example, Quintile's investing in venture capital ways of pharmaceutical companies is a good thing necessarily, while they're also guarding the hen house.
Right, and these are wonderful arguments. I would suggest first that when you're talking about many of these integrated relationships, you're talking about multi-billion-dollar companies where the potential conflict of interest does not necessarily translate down to the level of the study monitor and the study coordinator. These are people that have spent time in so many different arenas. They may have been trained in an academic environment. They may have worked at pharma at one point. They may be now working at a site as a study coordinator or whatever. So part of the message is that we're talking about very, very large and fragmented companies where you still have fundamentally professionals that want to do a good job, and I believe that. I mean, it's somewhat of a more difficult fact to demonstrate when you're really sort of thinking at a high level, but that's part of the issue. I think the other point is that integration may ultimately remove the marginalization of the investigator and the study staff. I think it might actually transfer more of what you were describing, Rob, back to the investigative site. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there was so much of a focus to micromanage at the pharma company, even at levels that were so brash that they moved us away from leveraging the real benefit and the value of the physician investigator. And I think the integration is a way of transferring